background on this project, among other projects. As many or most of you are aware, we tried to provide universities a little support to do projects such as this kind of research mode. They are competitive for the most part. And actually, this project was one of the first ones that we did this way. Judy has just recently, I don't know, Judy, how long ago? Less than a year ago, finished her PhD with Dr. Bob Graham. March, I didn't see, I was right, it was less than a year. With Dr. Bob Graham at the University of California, Riverside. She's the one that actually did the work on this project and used it to complete her PhD. And she's now actually at the Richard Stockton College in Jersey. And I'll let Judy go ahead and introduce herself to us. So, carry on.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to get started. So first of all, I wanted to say a big thank you to Larry West for inviting me to give the webinar today, and to Sean McVeigh for helping me to get set up with the live feeding and everything. And first off, this is the research that I did for my dissertation at the University of California, Riverside, and I worked with my advisor, Bob Graham. And as Larry West mentioned, we got funding from the National Soil Survey Center, but also supplemented this funding with funding from the NRCS in California. We also got a small research grant from the NSF and supplemental funding from the UPR Agriculture Experiment Station. So the vesicular horizon, as the title says, is a critical component of arid and semi-arid land. So I like to start out with this slide showing the worldwide distribution of arid and semi-arid land. So you can see all the orange shaded areas are designated as extremely arid, arid, or semi-arid, and in total these occupy about a third of the Earth's land surface. And my focus was on the vesicular horizon, which is just the very surface layer of arid soils. So these are either surface or near surface horizon. They're very often associated with desert pavement. Let's see if I can get the pointer. So the desert pavement is the surface layer of gravel that you can see a nice example of on this slide. But they're not always associated with desert pavement. Sometimes they're beneath either a physical or a biological surface crust. The vesicular horizon itself is shown here. It's the thin layer beneath the desert pavement in this photo. And it's usually less than 10 centimeters thick, so it is a very thin horizon. And the most prominent morphologic feature of this horizon is the predominance of vesicular pores, which are these bubble-like pores that you can see throughout the horizon. And they are nearly spherical in shape, and they're discontinuous, so they're very poor at conducting water. And they have an appearance like air bubbles, so they're actually formed by bubbles that get frozen in place as the soil dries. So the air bubbles get trapped when the soil is wet and then get stuck in place when the soil dries. Other distinguishing features of the vesicular horizon include the characteristic structure, which is typically columnar structure that parts the platy structure. Although I'll show a lot of examples of these horizons throughout the presentation, and you'll see in some of them the columnar structure is a much more prominent feature, and in other cases the platy structure is more prominent. So first of all, the vesicular horizon is very often associated with desert pavement. So this is a nice example of, there we go. This is a nice example of the desert pavement. This is a very prominent feature of the desert landscape. And some of the distinctive features are, first of all, you notice it's dark in color. So that black color comes from desert varnish, which is a coating that forms on rock fragments that are exposed for long periods of time in the desert. The desert pavement is also characteristically very smooth in topography and has a low vegetation cover. When you look up close at the desert pavement, you can see it's basically a mosaic of interlocking rock fragments that form this surface coating. And then you cut into the desert pavement, and you can see it's actually just a monolayer of rock fragments. And immediately beneath the desert pavement, there's a relatively gravel-free zone, which is often where we find the vesicular horizon. And the way that this gravel-free zone forms is through aeolian material, dust that gets trapped beneath the rock fragments and actually lifts them up. This is a major mechanism of desert pavement formation. But as I mentioned, vesicular horizons are not always associated with desert pavement. This is a paper that was published earlier this year showing vesicular horizons that form beneath biological soil crust. This is an example of specifically the moss lichen form of crust, which has a rough microtopography. These surfaces also have a tendency to trap dust. That dust accumulates beneath the biological surface crust, and then once you get a thick enough zone of dust, that can actually result in a layer that forms a vesicular horizon. So we can think of the method of vesicular horizon formation as a three-step process. Although these three steps in the process occur somewhat separately and somewhat simultaneously, so you can't really think of it as a process. But the main components are first aeolian deposition. So what this does is it enriches the surface layer of the soil in aeolian silts and fine sands, which are the major texture that's conducive to the formation of the vesicular horizon. The second step is that there has to be some sort of seal that forms at the surface that cuts off the above-ground atmosphere from the soil atmosphere. And this can be either a layer of rock fragments, like we have with the desert pavement, or it can be either a physical or a biological surface crust. The third step in vesicular horizon formation is that you have cyclic wetting and drying of the soil surface that results in the entrapment of air bubbles that form the vesicular pores. So this figure is showing each time the soil becomes wet, air bubbles get trapped, and then as the soil dries, that air expands and leaves imprints that form the vesicular pores. Also in these wetting and drying events, you get shrinking and swelling of the soil material, which results in the polygonal cracking that forms the columnar structure. And another thing that can happen is as these pores expand and merge with each other, the pores grow to such a size that they can't support the weight of the soil and they collapse, which is the major mechanism by which clady structure forms in these horizons. So one of the interesting things about vesicular pores is that they can actually be destroyed and recreated. And this has been known for a long time. You can actually take a sample of the vesicular horizon and crush it up so you destroy all the vesicular pores. And if you expose that material to repeated wetting and drying in the laboratory, you can actually get the pores to reform. So here, this is a study from 1971 showing the vesicular pores reforming in the lab. This is after 4 wetting and drying cycles. You see just some very tiny pores starting to form at the surface. And then over 8 wetting and drying cycles, 14 and 25, you see the continuous growth of the vesicular pores. So the significance of these in the arid landscape, first I wanted to go over just a little bit about the land use in the desert region. So this is a map of land use in the Mojave Desert portion that's in California. And you can see there's a very large area of land that's owned by the Bureau of Land Management, several military bases, which are in purple, and then a lot of national park land that's in green. So we have a lot of relatively undeveloped land in the desert. But there are several increasing land uses. One is the expansion of urban population. So examples of cities in the desert are Las Vegas. The population of Las Vegas increased by over 500,000 between 2000 and 2010. The population of Phoenix increased by nearly 1 million over that period. One of the main recreational uses of the land is off-road driving. This is one of the off-road vehicle areas in Southern California, Johnson Valley. It's about 800 kilometers square and gets about 200,000 visitors per year. And these are images of the land surface. This is an alluvial fan surface immediately outside of the off-road vehicle area and then within the off-road vehicle area. So you can see all these linear features or the tire tracks. So you can see that off-roading can have a really dramatic impact military land use. And, this is a study that looked at a military training ground that were used in the World War II era and then haven't been used since. So this is a study 2004. They went back and looked at some of the track scars that had persisted since World War II era into the 2000s. And one of the really rapidly expanding desert land uses is that millions of acres of desert land are being approved for large-scale solar and wind farms. This is an illustration from the LA Times of one of the big solar arrays that are being constructed. This is along the I-15 freeway, right on the boundary between Nevada and California. So this is actually that same site from the LA Times illustration. Here I was driving by and stopped to take a picture of them constructing the solar array. So you can see there's a lot of dust being produced from the soil at this site due to the construction. And this can be related to vesicular horizons because they are a surface horizon that's formed in eolating material. So when they're disturbed, they have a tendency to release a lot of dust. This is a study from an off-road vehicle area demonstrating the link between vesicular horizons and dust emissions. Here we're looking at dust emissions with increasing driving speeds. And each of the different lines here represents a different type of surface that the authors characterized. And what I want you to notice is that one of the most emissive surfaces was actually the desert pavement surface. And the reason why the desert pavement surface emits so much dust is because it's associated with the vesicular horizon. And dust emissions from desert soils can have wide-reaching ecological impacts. This is a study linking dust emissions from desert soils to the snowpack and surrounding mountain ranges. So what they found in this study is that when the snowpack becomes coated in dust, which is what we see with the red line, compared to clean snow that doesn't have dust on it, there's a decrease in the albedo of the soil. This means that more light is absorbed and less light is reflected, and this leads to faster melting of the snow. So going back to the desert ecosystem, this is an image showing the contrast between what we call the shrub component of the landscape and the interspace. So this is one of the basic ecological principles of the desert ecosystem, that there's these two distinctly different components of the landscape, which have distinctly different soil properties. So these are different terminologies are used to describe this. So some people call it the shrub and interspace. Sometimes it's the canopy and intercanopy. Another terminology is dune and interdune. This refers to the fact that the shrubs have a tendency to trap dust and produce what are called coppice dunes. So you tend to have micro-highs around the shrubs and micro-lows between them. The shrub areas are also sometimes referred to as resource islands or islands of fertility. So basically all describing the same phenomena that the shrubs tend to grow in clusters, and when a new shrub establishes, it tends to establish in those clusters instead of in the interspace areas. So this is a study from the Journal of Range Management highlighting this contrast between the two parts of the landscape. And here they're highlighting the microtopography associated, where you have coppice dunes and then micro-lows in between the coppice dunes. And what they're showing is the difference in the surface morphology between these different positions in the landscape. And this part of the illustration is showing the vesicular pores. These little illustrations of bubbles are representing the vesicular horizon. And what you'll notice is that the vesicular horizon occurs in the interspace part of the landscape. It does not occur beneath the shrubs. Another important principle relating to the vesicular horizon is that it has a very strong impact on the surface hydrology of desert ecosystems. This is a study from the Desert Research Institute. This is showing infiltration rates measured on surfaces with increasing soil age. So this is a chronosequence of alluvial fan surfaces in the Mojave Desert. And if you look at just the yellow bars, this is where they removed the desert pavement and measured infiltration rate directly into the surface horizon, which in the older three surfaces was a vesicular horizon. And what you'll notice is that with increasing surface age, as the vesicular horizons develop, there is a decrease in infiltration rate. And I should point out this is on a logarithmic scale, so this is a really dramatic decrease in infiltration that's taking place. What the red bars are showing is that when the vesicular horizon was removed and they measured infiltration directly into the underlying horizon, which was either a B horizon or an AC horizon, there was no longer a decrease in infiltration rate with increasing age. So this was isolating the vesicular horizon as the feature of the soil that's controlling infiltration. This is another study which shows a similar principle in a slightly different way. So here, again, we're looking at infiltration rate with increasing soil age. But here what they did was they looked separately at the intercanopy soils, so the soils that tend to have vesicular horizons, and at the undercanopy soils, which do not develop vesicular horizons. And what you see is that in the intercanopy, there is a decrease in infiltration rate with increasing age. But in the undercanopy soils, you don't see that same trend. Another photo illustrating the surface hydrology of desert ecosystems. This is a photo taken during a rainstorm in the Mojave Desert. Here, this is a surface with desert pavement that has vesicular horizons underneath it. And you can actually see the water ponding and running off from the areas in between the shrubs. So what's going on is that we have low infiltration rates between the shrubs in the interspace areas and high infiltration rates beneath the shrubs. So there tends to be runoff and concentration of water in the shrub islands. So this helps to support the natural pattern of plant growth in the desert landscape. This is just an aerial photograph, sort of so you can think about the surface hydrology of these systems. So all of the dark areas are the desert pavement. So this is dark because of the desert varnish. This is an alluvial fan surface, so we have washes dissecting the surface and shrubs growing in those washes. And then each of these little white spots is a shrub island. So you can see we have a large area of the desert pavement that tends to promote runoff, and then that runoff concentrates in the washes or in the shrub islands where the plants grow. So getting to what I did for my research, the first question that I had when I started doing this research was, how am I going to quantify vesicular horizon development? How am I going to look at vesicular horizons in one part of the landscape and compare them to another part of the landscape? So I came up with two approaches. The first was the simpler approach, which I could just directly calculate based on field observations. And the advantage to this was that I could also use existing data and apply this technique in order to quantify vesicular horizon development from existing field descriptions. So I started out with some morphologic description, and I extracted three values. The first was the thickness of the vesicular horizon in centimeters. So this would be the thickness of the zone in which vesicular horizons were the predominant type, vesicular pores were the predominant type of pore. The second was the vesicular pore quantity class, so whether there were few, common, or many vesicular pores. And the third was the vesicular pore size class, so whether they were very fine, medium, coarse, or very coarse. I then assigned a numerical value to the size class and the quantity class, and then calculated what I called the vesicular pore term. So this was just the sum of the quantity class plus the size class for each of the different size classes that occurred. And then I set that on the scale from 0 to 1 by dividing by the maximum possible value for the vesicular pore term, which was 220. And then I multiplied that value by the thickness of the horizon to calculate the final vesicular horizon index. So in order to test this out, I calculated the vesicular horizon index based on data from a chrono sequence study. This was Eric McDonald's dissertation at the Providence Mountains chrono sequence, which is in the Mojave National Preserve. And what I saw was that there was a nice increase in vesicular horizon index with increasing age, which shows that with increasing development of the vesicular horizon, that was reflected in an increase in the vesicular horizon index. The exception was the oldest surface in the chrono sequence, and the authors of the study documented that that surface had been eroded. So we also see that with erosion and degradation of the vesicular horizon, there's a decrease in vesicular horizon index. In addition to just my field morphology, I also wanted some way that I could collect more detailed data on the core morphology. So the approach I used here was CT scanning, or computed tomography. So this shows what's called a slice of a CT scan. So this is basically a virtual cross-section through the sample, and it's not a photograph, it's a map of the density inside the sample, which is based on the rate of X-ray attenuation. And this analysis was done at the University of Texas High-Resolution X-ray Computed Tomography Facility, which is a facility that specializes in CT scanning of all types of geologic samples. So based on the CT scan, I could use image analysis software to separate out the lower density zones, which were the pores, and then also separate out the higher density zones, which were the gravel. But the really nice thing about computed tomography is that you don't just get a single cross-section through the sample. You actually get a continuous series of these virtual slices, which can be put together in order to build a three-dimensional model of the pores. So what I found when I looked at these 3D models is that there was actually 3 different major classes of pores that I saw in the vesicular horizon. These were the vesicular pores, which are the very spherical shaped pores. Sometimes they're ovoid, sometimes they're spherical, but they're the roundest pores. We also saw a lot of bugs, which are similar to the vesicular pores in that they're discontinuous from each other, but they tend to be more irregular in shape. And then I also described a number of interconnected pore networks. And what I mean by this, these are basically bugs that had short interconnecting channels in between them. So next, I had these 3 different types of pores that I observed in the samples. I needed some way that I could extract the data from the CT scans without having to go through and look at each individual pore in the thousands of pores per sample and hundreds of samples that I was analyzing. So what I came up with was I derived a volumetric form of a method that's used to analyze pore shape in thin sections. It's called the lobation ratio. And basically it's an index of how spherical a shape is based on the ratio between its surface area and its volume. So like what I did was I went through one of my samples and I actually identified the pores visually as vesicles, bugs, they're interconnected. And then for each of those that I had identified, I calculated the lobation ratio and looked at the correspondence between the lobation ratio and which pore shape it fell into. And so I found that I could separate the pores into vesicles, which had a lobation ratio greater than 0.79, bugs, which had intermediate lobation ratio, and the interconnected pores, which had lobation ratio between 0.58. Then once I had the pores classified into what shape they were, I can calculate 3 different values from the CT scan. The first is the percent of the sample volume that was occupied by pores of a certain shape. And what this formula is showing is that this was a gravel-corrected volume, so I was taking into account how much of the sample was gravel. The second value I calculated was the number of pores per sample volume. This is also sometimes referred to as number density, and this corresponds more with the quantity of the pores in the sample. And then the third value I calculated was the geometric mean of pore volume. So this is corresponding with the size of the individual pores. So going on to part 2. So now that I had my techniques for analyzing the vesicular horizons, the first question that I looked at was what is the geographic distribution and range of characteristics of the vesicular horizon? So first, this map is showing a rough estimation of the worldwide distribution of vesicular horizons. So the background gray map, this is the same map that I showed you on the first slide. This is the USDS map of arid and semi-arid land. And then each of these yellow points is an example of a scientific study that documents the presence of vesicular horizons in different parts of the world. So what we can see is that vesicular horizons occur on every continent on Earth. There's there's even a study of vesicular horizons in Antarctica, and they're mainly associated with arid and semi-arid lands. In the U.S., I was able to use the NRCS databases to get an even better look at the distribution of vesicular horizons. So the first thing I did was I went through the official series descriptions and found all of the soil series that had vesicular horizons in them. So there was a total of 1,092 soil series with vesicular horizons. And when I added up the total area mapped for these soil series in the Surgo database, this added up to 157,000 kilometers square. This map is showing the distribution in the StatsGo database, so all of the gray areas are areas with map units that have one of the soil series with vesicular horizons as a major component. So here we can see a little bit where these soils with vesicular horizons occur. You can see they mostly follow the outline of the basin and range province. Next, again, using the NRCS databases, I looked at the texture of the vesicular horizons. This is showing the laboratory textures plotted on the textural triangle. And you can see they are somewhat concentrated in the silt corner. The vesicular horizons do tend to be silt-rich because they are concentrated, because they are formed in aeolian material. But there is a wide range of textures that occur in vesicular horizons. This next graph, this is looking instead at the field-determined textures. And there were 5 most commonly described field-determined textures in the vesicular horizon. These were loams, sandy loams, fine sandy loams, very fine sandy loams, and silt loams. And here what I did was I calculated my vesicular horizon index for each of the 5 textural classes that commonly occurred in the vesicular horizon. And we see that there's a slightly higher vesicular horizon index for the silt loams, the median, but it wasn't a statistically significant difference. So we do see pretty good development of vesicular horizons across the textures. Next, these are chemical properties of the vesicular horizons, again, from the NRCS databases. First, organic carbon. The organic carbon content was, the median content was 0.7%. Electrical conductivity median was 1.2. Extinguishable sodium percentage was 2%. So these were mostly non-saline, non-sodic soils. The pH median was 8, and the calcium carbonate percentage was, the median was 4%. The interquartile range was from 0 to 12%. And I should point out, there were a lot of zeros in this data set. So there are a lot of vesicular horizons that contain no calcium carbonate, which means you don't need calcium carbonate in order to form the vesicular horizon. So next, this is another map derived from the NRCS databases. Each of the points on this map is either a type location for an official series description that has a vesicular horizon, or it's a NASA's head-on description that has a vesicular horizon. So with this point data, what I did was I overlaid it with the Amarnic ecoregions, which divide the basin and range province up into 4 different ecological zones. So the top 2 ecological zones are the northern basin and range and the central basin and range. These are sometimes lumped together and called the Great Basin. These are considered the cold desert. They have higher precipitation, lower temperature, and tend to be dominated by sagebrush vegetation. Next, we have the Mojave Desert and the Sonoran Desert. These are considered the hot desert. They have lower precipitation, higher temperature, and tend to be dominated by creosote bush. These are photographs taken in 3 of the ecoregions, the Central Basin and Range, Mojave, and Sonoran. So you can see these are all shrub-dominated landscapes. They all have this characteristic shrub and interspace landscape component. But we do have a slightly higher shrub cover when we look at the Central Basin and Range compared to the Mojave Desert, and even lower in the Sonoran Desert. So what I did with this data was once I had my points grouped by Amarnic ecoregion, I calculated the vesicular horizon index for each of the different ecoregions. And what I found was kind of an interesting trend. I found that there was actually a higher vesicular horizon index, and this was would be best expressed in the most arid parts of the desert, in the Sonoran and Mojave, where we have the lowest rainfall and highest temperatures, but they're actually better expressed in the cold desert. In addition to looking at the databases, I also went out and collected samples from the Sonoran, Mojave, and Central Basin and Range deserts. And with the samples that I collected, I used the CT scanning procedure. And here's this graphic showing the percentage of the sample volume that's occupied by vesicles and bugs. So here this is showing them together. And we saw that there was, just like we saw with the database, we saw that there was a greater percentage of vesicles and bugs in the soils from the Central Basin and Range compared to the Sonoran and Mojave deserts. And so now you see what the data looks like. Let's look at what the soils actually look like in these three different ecoregions. So these are photos that I took in the Sonoran desert. So you can see, we see pretty weak expression of the vesicular horizons here. The vesicular pores are very small, probably hard to distinguish in these photographs. But in some of the sites, we did see really strong expression of columnar structure in the vesicular horizon, which you can see nicely in this photo from Quartzsite, Arizona. These are photos from the Mojave Desert. So now we still have pretty thin vesicular horizons, but the vesicular pores are a little bit larger and easier to distinguish. And again, some of the sites have fairly weak structure, but I also saw some sites that had very strong expression of the columnar structure. And last, these are samples from the Great Basin Desert. And now these horizons tended to be thicker, the vesicular pores are larger, and these two photos show a really nice illustration of the two types of structure that you'll see in the vesicular horizon. So the first photograph, you see a really nice example of a vesicular horizon with strong clady structure. Second photograph, you see a vesicular horizon with a greater expression of the columnar structure. So what is the reason for the difference in vesicular horizon expression between the different ecoregions? So in order to think about this, I broke it down into what factor of soil formation is controlling this trend. So the first possibility is that this is controlled by climate. So remember, we have higher precipitation and lower temperatures in the cold desert. And we know that vesicular horizons are formed by repeated wetting and drying cycles. So it could be that because there's more frequent precipitation, there's more wetting and drying cycles, which means that there's more opportunity for vesicular pores to form in the cold desert. So this is showing the average annual precipitation frequency expressed as number of events per year across the 4 different ecoregions. The other possible controlling factor is parent material. So vesicular horizons are formed in aeolian parent material. And one of the theories of how vesicular horizons form is that there was, during the transition between the Pleistocene and Holocene era, there was a drying of pluvial lakes, and those pluvial lakes released a large pulse of dust, which was distributed across the landscape, forming vesicular horizons. So here we see the map of Pleistocene pluvial lakes. So we have Lake Bonneville that shrunk down to form the Great Salt Lake, Lake Lahontan that covered much of western Nevada, Lake Manly that covered the floor of Death Valley. And if you look at the distribution of these pluvial lakes, they're much more widespread in the northern part of the Basin and Range province. So it could be that because we had a greater extent of these pluvial lakes in the northern part of the Basin and Range, there was more sources of dust, which means we have better expression of vesicular horizons. So it's possible that this trend we see is linked to climate or to parent material, or it could be a combination of both. So the third part of my presentation deals with the effects of disturbance on vesicular horizons. So my question here was, what effects does disturbance of the soil surface have on vesicular horizons? So one of the reasons why I was interested in this question was because, as I showed you with the laboratory results at the beginning of the presentation, the vesicular pores can actually be disturbed and reformed on a relatively quick time scale. So one possibility is that disturbance has very little effect because the vesicular pores regenerate so quickly. Another possibility is that they don't recover quickly enough when we do see disturbance effects. So since I knew that vesicular horizons displayed the drastic difference between the ecoregions. I divided my study sites up among 3 of the different ecological zones. I had 5 sites in the Sonoran Desert, 5 in the Mojave, and 5 in the Central Basin and Range. And I looked at 3 different features that displayed disturbance in these landscapes. One was tire tracks, so I compared soil samples that I collected from tire tracks with soil samples collected from beneath undisturbed desert pavement. I also looked at coppice dunes. So remember, the coppice dunes typically don't have vesicular horizons, but when I was in the Great Basin, I saw a lot of vesicular horizons that had been buried beneath coppice dunes. So what was happening was that a shrub was establishing, building a coppice dune, and the vesicular horizon that had previously been at the surface was becoming buried. And so I was interested in this because this could reflect during different climatic periods when you've had expansion of vegetation on the landscape, what effect this would have on the vesicular horizon. Does the vesicular horizon persist through these periods when vegetation expands, or is it destroyed by that process? And the third thing that I looked at was disturbance plots that I actually set up in order to control the form of disturbance and the exact time that I was giving for recovery of the vesicular horizon. So I was looking at 2 forms of pre-existing disturbance where I didn't have very good experimental control, and then I had this third form of disturbance where it was maybe less realistic, but I had really good experimental control. So this is an example of one of the tire tracks that I examined. Here I collected a sample from within the tire track and then from beneath the nearby desert pavement. And these are slices from CT scans showing the difference between the vesicular horizons. You do see pretty good vesicular pores in both the tire tracks and the undisturbed samples, but maybe a little smaller in the tire tracks. There was also a pretty pronounced structural difference between the desert pavement and the tire track. So this first photograph this is beneath the undisturbed desert pavement. So here I removed the desert pavement clasp and took a photo of the surface of the vesicular horizon immediately beneath the desert pavement. And here this is the surface in the tire track. So what you see is a flattening of the top of these rounded columnar head tops. And these are the data extracted from the CT scan. So this first slide shows the data just for the vesicular pores. So these are just the pores that are rounded in shape. And the 3 types of data I'm showing here, this is first the percentage of the sample volume that's occupied by vesicles, then the number density of the pores, so this corresponds to the quantity of the pores, and then the geometric mean of pore volume, so this corresponds with the size of the pores. And when we compare the pores that classified as vesicles based on their shape, there's actually very little difference between the tire track and undisturbed soil. They had similar total volume, similar number, and similar size. This is the data for the pores that classified as bugs. With the bugs, again, we didn't see much difference between the tire tracks and the undisturbed sites. They were similar in total volume, similar in number, and similar in size. Where we did see the difference was in the interconnected pores. So these are bugs that have short interconnecting channels. In this case, we saw that there was a smaller total volume of the interconnected pores. They were similar in number, but they were smaller in size. So the next disturbance feature that I looked at was the coppice dunes. So again, we didn't have vesicular horizons with the surface of the coppice dunes. These were vesicular horizons that had become buried beneath the coppice dunes. So I would sample beneath one of the coppice dunes and then beneath the surrounding desert pavement. And these are slices from CT scans. And here, just looking at these slices of CT scans, you can actually see there's a much more pronounced difference than we saw with the tire track. We start out with much larger vesicular pores, and these are collapsing, and you see better expression of clady structure in this CT scan from beneath the coppice dunes. This is one of my field photographs. So here you see the coppice dune sediments above the vesicular horizon that I sampled. So this was a vesicular horizon that had become buried when the coppice dune was established. And and data from the CT scan. Again, this is the data just for the vesicles, so these are the rounded pores. The vesicles beneath the compass dunes were smaller in total volume. They were similar in number, but they were smaller in size. So what we're seeing is a collapse of the large vesicular pores to form smaller vesicular pores. Same trend with the bugs. These were smaller in total volume, similar in number, and smaller in size. With the interconnected pores, we see a slightly different trend. There was actually an increase in the total volume of interconnected pores, an increase in number, but a decrease in size. So they're collapsing, but more of them are forming, so you have a larger total volume. So if we look at the CT scan, these interconnected pores, I want to point out, are these lateral interconnections between bugs. I did see some root channels growing through these samples that I collected beneath the compass dunes, but not a lot. Most of these interconnected pores were these lateral voids. So next, looking at the data from the one-year disturbance plot. So this is demonstrating how I set these up. So first what I did was I removed the desert pavement class and set those aside. Then I made a small excavation just through the depth of the vesicular horizon. And I removed that material, I crushed it up, and added it back to the excavation, put the desert pavement class back on the surface, and left these out in the field for a year, and came back 1 year later and looked at the recovery of the vesicular horizon. These are photographs from one of my field sites in the Great Basin. So here, this is before disturbance, what the vesicular horizon looked like. It was a few centimeters thick, had fairly large vesicles and bugs, and a vesicular horizon index of 3.7. Following disturbance, we did see at the site pretty good recovery of the vesicular horizon, but the pores are much smaller. It's much thinner now, only about 2 centimeters thick, and the VHI that I would compute for this is 0.5, so we see a decrease in the vesicular horizon index. This is pre- and post-disturbance vesicular horizons from a site in the Sonoran Desert. So here, this is one of the sites that had really strong columnar structure. The pores occurred in a zone that was a few centimeters thick. They're not as large as the pores that you see in the Great Basin. So the VHI started out as 2.9. Then following disturbance and 1 year of recovery, I came back and post-disturbance, the vesicular pores are really only forming in this really thin layer, only a few millimeters thick. But what was interesting at this site was that we started to see some little bit of recovery of the columnar structure. So here the VHI of the post-disturbance soil was 0.2, so a really drastic decrease in vesicular horizon index. One of the interesting trends that I observed when I looked at the post-disturbance soils was that the post-disturbance vesicular horizon index showed a really strong relationship with precipitation. So 9 of my field sites were close enough to a climate station that I could use weather data from the recovery year in order to calculate the number of precipitation events that occurred at the site. So when I looked at the relationship between the number of precipitation events and the vesicular horizon index of the recovered vesicular horizons, I saw that there was a linear trend with an R-square value of 0.88. So there seemed to be that the main factor controlling the degree to which the vesicular horizons recovered was the number of times that it rained over the course of the year. And we also see a relationship to the ecoregion, particularly in the Sonoran Desert. We had a very low number of precipitation events, which led to very low vesicular horizon index. So based on this trend, we can predict how long it would take the vesicular horizons to recover at these field areas. What I used was the vesicular horizon index of the pre-disturbance soil. So what's our goal? What are we trying to get to call recover? And then the average number of precipitation events per year. So based on this equation, which is extrapolating beyond the range of the data that I observed, so it could have some issues with the prediction. But what I found was that the recovery times were predicted to be between 2 and 11 years for recovery of the vesicular horizon. So this recovery time would generally be shorter in the Great Basin where we have more frequent precipitation, and the longer recovery time would be needed in the Sonoran Desert where you have very, very infrequent precipitation. So the way that I sampled these in the field was a little bit different from the other disturbance features. So now instead of sampling an undisturbed site and a disturbed site, instead I was sampling an undisturbed site, then disturbing that site, and sampling after disturbance, and actually after disturbance and then 1 year of recovery. So these are slices from the CT scans. So before disturbance, you can see we have a much thicker zone with vesicular pores, and the pores are much larger. Following disturbance, we see some vesicular pores starting to form, but they're in a very thin layer, and they're much smaller in size. So if we look at the data, this is the data for the vesicles. So we saw there was a smaller total volume of vesicles. They were actually greater in number following disturbance, but they were smaller in size. And this is actually the same thing that's seen when you look at recovery of vesicular pores in the lab. So in the initial stages of vesicular pore formation, you actually have a larger number of pores that are smaller in size. And then as the pores grow, they merge with each other. And because they're merging with each other, that decreases the number of pores, but leads to growth of the pores. With the bug-shaped pores, we saw they were also smaller in total volume, similar in number, but smaller in size. And then with the interconnected pores, they were also smaller in total volume, similar in number, and smaller in size. So what I found across the 3 parts of my study, the first question I asked was, how can we measure vesicular horizons? And I came up with 2 systems. The first was the vesicular horizon index, which can be computed from field data. So this is really easy to work with and can be applied to existing data. The second approach that I used was analysis of pores using computed tomography. So this allowed me to get really detailed data on the size and shape of the pores. The next question was, what is the geographic distribution and range of characteristics of vesicular horizons? So in terms of the distribution, I found that they cover 157,000 kilometers square in the western United States. They have a wide range of chemical properties and textures, so they're not highly restricted to certain soil properties. And they're best expressed in the cold deserts relative to the hot desert. And my third question was, what effect does disturbance of the soil surface have on vesicular horizons? I found that disturbance both decreased the vesicular horizon index and altered the pore morphology. And I found that the rate of recovery was most highly dependent on the frequency of precipitation. So that concludes my presentation, and I guess we can move on to the question and answer.
All right. Well, thank you, Judy. I've got 3 questions that have been submitted, and again, I just remind people that you can submit a question by going to the Q&A link at the top of the live meeting frame, and I'll queue up these questions. So the first question is from Susan Perez. Oh, she says she's having trouble viewing them. It was slow loading, but I think that's been resolved. I'll go to the next question. I have a 2-part question. 1, is the pavement on this desert floor useful for anything? In other words, could it be processed for making roads? Do you want to tackle that one before I go to the second part?
I guess I'll answer that question first. I'm not sure specifically if it's useful for making roads, but I think it's providing a service by its presence at the surface because it's protecting the surface from being eroded. So it has an ecological service in its function.
The second part.
What's the second question?
Second part of it is, if this pavement were to be harvested for a helpful use, if there is one, what would that mean for the vesicular horizon? Could we see the disappearance of the horizon and have better infiltration, or would it just result in more wind erosion?
I think, yes, both. You would see destruction of the vesicular horizon and wind erosion.
And I'll go on to another question from Tom Reich. Vesicular horizons are also observed in surface horizons dispersed with sodium. What relation would these horizons have with your study?
So some of the vesicular horizons, both at my field sites and in the database, were sodic soils. So they weren't all non-sodic, but they occur both in sodic and non-sodic soils. So I think the dispersed condition probably does promote vesicular horizon formation because in order for the pores to form, you have to have weak aggregate stability. So, and also that because they're linked to that crusting process where you have to have some sort of barrier between the atmosphere and the soil. Sodic soils are susceptible to crusting. So if you have formation of a surface crust, that can promote the formation of vesicular pores.
Okay. And then there's a comment here from Nelson Rolong about vesicular horizons are a common feature in the Chihuahuan Desert, in Texas and New Mexico, and in less extension in the high plain without presence of columnar structure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you mentioned that could have a couple different structures with the presence of vesicular pores.
Yeah, so you were saying that they didn't have expression of columnar structure?
Correct, without presence of columnar structure.
That's in different sites, you'll see better and weaker expression of the structure. And yeah, I focus entirely on the Basin and Range province. I don't know a lot about the characteristics outside of that zone. On the databases, I was really surprised at how few vesicular horizons show up in the Chihuahuan Desert, and I don't really have a good explanation for why that is. But it's interesting to hear from someone who's familiar with that area that they do occur there.
And then a question from Sharon Waltman. Would the vesicular pores be considered the result of modern climates or possibly paleoclimates? How old might these horizons be?
So they can be linked to paleoclimate in that this idea of how the vesicular horizon formed through this big pulse of dust that occurred during the Pleistocene to Holocene transition. So any period of very active eolian activity can be linked to formation of vesicular horizons. So some of them are very old horizons. I think, especially in areas where you see really thick vesicular horizons, those probably reflect several periods of very, very high eolian activity. But they can also form very quickly. So when you see the really thin ones, those are more linked probably to the recent climate.
And a somewhat related question from Mike Domeyer. What is the amount of precipitation required to be a precipitation event, and what would be the depth of the associated wetting front?
I have to look back at my notes. I think I used the cutoff as 5 millimeters. So assuming you have 50% porosity, that would be wetting the soil to 1 centimeter depth. So I figured anything smaller than that would be really insignificant. So that's what I used as the cutoff.
And then a question from Joseph Dyer. Does disturbance, say grazing, affect the concentrating effect of rainfall and therefore range condition?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Does disturbance, say grazing, affect the concentrating effect of rainfall and therefore range condition?
So yeah, I think the grazing could, through compaction, lead to the concentration of runoff, so it could function similarly to the desert pavement that we see. I didn't look very, very much at the effects of grazing, although the other impact is that it could lead to greater erosion of the vesicular horizon, and so counteract the effect.
And a question from Kit Paris. Have any studies been done relating the microbial populations and the health of the vesicular horizon? Does a higher VHI equate to more vigorous microbial environments that could affect fertility and other characteristics?
That's a hard question to answer. So I did actually, one of the experiments that I did was looking at whether microbial respiration played a role in the production of the air bubbles that form the vesicular pores. And so the results of that were kind of mixed. I found that the vesicular pores can form after you sterilize the soil. So clearly biological activity is not required for vesicular pores to form. But when I tried to stimulate greater respiration by adding glucose to the soil, I saw better formation of vesicular pores. So there could be a microbial component that leads to better expression of vesicular horizons, but it's not necessary. And then the other link that we see to the microbial system is this link that sometimes you see vesicular horizons forming beneath biological soil crust. So the biological soil crust is another feature that can serve as the surface seal that cuts off the soil atmosphere from the above ground atmosphere and leads to the entrapment of air in the pores that forms the vesicular pores.
And I think we'll have this.
So I'm not sure if they answered the question, but that's what I know about the relationship to biota.
And then one last question, which is kind of a two-part question. Is there a relationship between the normal wetting front and undisturbed vesicular horizon thickness?
That I'm not sure about. So I guess the closest that I could have, comment that I could have to that is when I looked at the relationship between precipitation and recovery of the vesicular horizon following disturbance, when I looked at the data as number of events, there is a much stronger relationship than when I looked at the data simply as depth of precipitation. So that would seem to imply that there's not a really strong relationship to wetting front depth, but I can't think of any other specific study that's addressed that.
And then the follow-up to that question is, do you think that there's an interaction of biological soil crust and vesicular horizons like there is with plants?
So there are documented observations of vesicular horizons forming beneath biological soil crust, so they are associated in that way. I'm not sure if you're asking whether the vesicular horizons tend to shed water and concentrate water that is used by the biological soil crust. In that case, I'm not sure, but I think in the case of the biological soil crust, they require much less water than the plants do, and so just a small amount of rainfall without it being redistributed is what causes the crust to form in the interspace.
Judy, this is Larry West.
Hi.
You showed some data about infiltration through the vesicular horizon, the materials, the horizons, aren't shaking the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Did you try to make any infiltration measurements when you disturbed things and took them back, and what the recovery might have had impacts on infiltration?
Yes, I did measure that, and I was a little bit surprised by the results. So following recovery, there was pretty much no change in infiltration. So the infiltration was restricted both before and following disturbance. So what that indicates to me is that the material that forms vesicular pores promotes a very low infiltration rate, but it's not the actual presence of the vesicular pores that restricts infiltration. It's not because you have vesicular pores, it's because you have material that's conducive to forming vesicular pores. I guess is my interpretation. But I thought that following disturbance that you might see an increase in infiltration because we think of these vesicular pores as being discontinuous from each other, so they tend to restrict infiltration. But that's not what I found.
Well, with
Does
that
answer the question?
Absolutely.
With that, I think we'll conclude our webinar. I want to thank our speaker today. And again, this webinar has been recorded and it will be made available as an archive on our soils.usda.gov webpage, and search for webinars, presentations, and training sessions. Thanks all.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
Well done.